Hi, girls. So hopefully you're enjoying your surprise day off today. I enjoyed that phone call yesterday. Because of time, though, and because March exams are next week, I would like to kind of move through some of the notes. So this video over here, it's going to be in a set of two videos, and I'm going to be lecturing for the rest of these chapter notes. So if you don't have anything with you right now, I'd pause the video and either grab your notes if you have them. If you didn't bring them home with you over the weekend, that's fine. The notes are posted on the website. You don't have to print them out again. I would actually, if you don't have the notes with you, I would just grab a piece of loose leaf and just take down any extra notes and then maybe staple it to your packet when you get to school tomorrow. Okay, so if you remember our last class, we left off with evidence for evolution. So we started off the chapter with a little bit of history, right? We were talking about Darwin and all the people before him who made these observations and these ideas about how Earth has changed, or if Earth has changed over time. And Darwin is, as we know, kind of given the most credit for coming up with a mechanism, a reasoning for how evolution works. He came up with his theory of natural selection. He came up with the idea that all species that exist on this planet, from bacteria to humans, have a common ancestor. Millions and millions and millions of years ago, we started with one organism, and over time, some of those descendants of that organism became able to photosynthesize and became plants, and some, stayed in the water and some walked on land. And so many changes have happened to those descendants of that common ancestor that we have all the diversity that we have today on our planet. So how do we kind of know all that? How do we have all this evidence? It's not just based on Darwin's observations. We have a lot of different types of evidence too. So we started talking about direct observations, so things that we can actually see, examples of organisms that have changed over time in our generation or in a few generations. We left off with the fossil record. So fossils, I think, are the one that most people think of as the obvious evidence for evolution, because we actually see the remains of organisms that lived a long time ago that don't exist today. So we see organisms we've never seen before, and we've been able, kind of like a puzzle, piece together those fossils to make some sort of chronological conclusion as to how different species have changed over the years. So let's fast forward back to fossil record, which is our second piece of evidence. All right, I think this is where we left off. We were talking about sedimentary rock. Okay, so remember that fossils are remains or traces of organisms from the past. I think the last thing we actually talked about was fossil fuels and how we actually burn fossils from the past, and they give off carbon. Remember, because carbon is found in living things, and that's how we get petroleum and natural gas and oil. Paleontology, though, is the study of fossils. So paleontologists, archaeologists, are all scientists that study this area. So why are fossils important? Well, fossils help us show evolutionary change. If you see fossils of organisms and you're able to date it for a certain number of millions of years ago, and then you piece it together with other fossils that maybe are dated much more recent, maybe fossils that are dated even longer ago than the original, you can make some sort of timeline and see physically how those organisms have changed, how bone structure has changed, body parts have changed, size maybe have changed. And then you can make pretty good assumptions or inferences as to why maybe they changed. Maybe the environment changed. So scientists use fossils a lot for different reasons, but definitely understanding evolution is a big part. One important thing to know is that based on our study of fossils and our dating of fossils, meaning how old we think each fossil is, we've been able to have pretty credible evidence that the oldest fossils that exist are believed to be prokaryotes. So bacteria, prokaryotic cells. And then eukaryotes are a little bit more recent. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? Because prokaryotic cells, or prokaryotes, remember, are very simple. No nucleus, no major membrane-bound organelles. They're very simple. And eukaryotic cells and eukaryotes in general, those organisms, they're much more complicated. They're bigger. And so it makes sense that the oldest living things to have existed are the more simple. And as time went on, they got more complicated and maybe acquired different body parts or different complexities, different additions to their capabilities and to their cell structure. And then within eukaryotes, what we believe is the order in terms of the development of different groups of animals? Well, we believe that based on fossil evidence that fish are probably one of the oldest animals to have existed, coming out of the water. And then maybe millions of years later, some fish were able to kind of spend part of their life on land, part in the water, part on land. That would be amphibians. And then out of amphibians, we believe some of those amphibians found a way to stay their entire lives on land. And that would be the development of reptiles. And then some reptiles developed the ability to fly and the growth of feathers. You have birds. And then we have the development and the rise of mammals. Mammals being the most recent group of animals to develop and survive on this planet. If anyone wants to read one of the books in the extra credit library, I know Simone has read this, but if anyone is interested, probably not for this trimester because we're running a little bit late, but next trimester, there's a book called Your Inner Fish, and it talks a lot about our fossil evidence and the history of the evolution of animal species. Okay, and then transitional fossils are fossils that are of organisms that are in transition from one species to the next. So if you want to look back to whales, we were talking about whales in that activity, the first day of evolution, and how whales once had legs, but they don't have them anymore. A transitional fossil might be the fossil of a whale that maybe is starting to develop legs. And then maybe a transitional fossil might be, so then when they eventually went onto land and then they went back into the water, maybe it was a land animal that had a little bit of a fin or had a little bit. So they weren't fully whale or fully land animal, but something in between. Okay, so that's fossils. The next thing we'll be talking about, there's a few examples of homology, but remember, homology means the same. So homo is a prefix that means the same. Think of homologous chromosomes. If you think back to chemistry, homogeneous mixtures, homosexuality, homo means the same. So this is looking at similarities between species, looking at body parts, specifically looking at embryos, comparing embryos between organisms, and then we'll also be looking at comparing DNA, comparing molecules that are made between different species. Okay, so we'll be looking at first at homologous structures. Those are structures, body parts that are similar between animals. We're going to look and compare embryos, so homologies between embryos. We're going to be looking at vestigial organs, so organs that once had a use or once had a purpose years ago, but organisms have developed to maybe not use certain organs anymore, lifestyle changes, and so forth. And then we'll finish up with molecular. Okay, so homologous structures. Ooh, let's see. I don't know if you can, let's move that down. Okay. So if you look at these four organisms over here, we have a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. So if you think of them from the outside, not looking at their internal structures, on the outside, these four organisms are very different, and each of these four limbs have very different purposes. Think about it. Humans have their hands not to walk on, but to pick up things. Cats have their legs to walk on land. Whales have their fins to swim, and bats have their wings to fly. And so at first glance, these four animals don't look like they're very closely related because they have very, very different lifestyles. But upon further examination, what we see is that they actually have the same types of bones, and they're color-coded over here. We have the humerus in purple, so the humans aren't the only species with a humerus and a radius and an ulna for those anatomy people. Cats have them too, whales have them, bats have them. But if you look, especially bats and whales, they're just modified a little bit. Cats probably have a humerus that's most like us. Same with the radius and the ulna. Actually, cats have most of their bones are very similar to humans. And so what we realize is that, yes, we may have very different lifestyles, but because we have the same types of bones and in roughly the same order, you have purple on top, then orange, then yellow, then green, then blue. The reason this is a piece of evidence, this is an evidence for evolution, is because the common ancestor that led to humans, that eventually led to cats and whales and bats, must have had these same bone structures too, and that's how we inherited these bone types. And then over the years, because of course we're not exactly like whales, even though we have a lot in common, whales adapted to a different environment, so their bones modified over time, whether because of mutation, natural selection, whatever the case is. So homologous structures are structures between organisms or species that don't seem like they would have a lot in common, but they actually do, and that is evidence that they have a relatively recent common ancestor. Okay, vestigial structures are structures that I said before that still exist in organisms. So we definitely, as humans, have some vestigial structures. Animals in general, a lot of them have vestigial structures. They're structures that were useful at one point in our history, but don't have any apparent function anymore. They're kind of just there. Um, the appendix is kind of like the famous example of a vestigial structure. Early humans had a different type of diet, and the appendix was part, you can see here, the intestines. It played a role in digestion, and because our diet has changed, our lifestyles have changed, we don't need this part of our intestines anymore. So the appendix is kind of just there, and unfortunately, the only time we ever even notice our appendix is if something bad happens to it. If it becomes inflamed, it bursts, and then you have to have surgery. And most of the time, if you catch it early enough, it's fine. But the only time we notice it is, when there's trouble. So it's kind of a pain in the butt or a pain in the intestine. Okay, whales, of course, here in the circle over here, we have remnants of what used to be legs. We have a naked mole rat over here. So naked mole rat, for you guys who don't know, they live underground. And so they're in complete darkness all the time. They don't need to have eyes, but they still have remnants of eye structures. They're not actually being used, but they're still there. And then I have to be honest, I don't remember why I put this picture on the slide. I forget this example, but I think it has to do with this bird. Sort of like an emu, it has wings but doesn't actually fly. So the wings are vestigial. I'll have to get back to you on this one. I'm blanking right now why I put this picture here. Another example is wisdom teeth. So early humans used to have bigger jaws and bigger skulls, which gave them bigger jaws, which means we had more room for teeth. But as our skull size has shortened over the years or gotten smaller, we have had less room for teeth. And so for some of us, it's not that big of a deal. Our wisdom teeth don't come in, or they come in okay. But for some of us, because our jaw size is smaller, our wisdom teeth are trying to come in and they can't. And so it causes a lot of pain when they do, and we have to get them removed. All right, so wisdom teeth are also vestigial structures. Male nipples are also vestigial structures. They have no apparent use, but because they're developed very early on in the fetus before the gender is actually official. So when a fetus, before it can tell whether it's a boy or a girl yet, the nipples have already started developing. So by the time it is a boy, there's no point to get rid of the nipples. They've already been developed. But they are vestigial structures because obviously males do not produce milk for their babies. Okay, and then finally, we're going to finish off here with this video is analogous structures. So analogous structures are kind of the opposite of homologous structures. These are structures between organisms that you would think are very closely related because they kind of look the same, they have very similar functions, but upon further examination, they really don't have that much in common structure-wise. So they actually explain how distantly related species can be because their similarities are kind of superficial. So for example, a bat wing and a bird wing, yes, you have a mammal and a bird, so two very different animals, but you can see they still have kind of a similar bone structure. They have the yellow, the red, the blue, the purple, so they have very similar types of bones, which means they probably have inherited this from a more recent common ancestor, so these are homologous to each other. But if you compare a bat wing to an insect wing, you'd think, okay, bats and insects, they both fly, they're probably very similar, but insects don't even have bones. And so the structure of what makes up these wings are very different. And so why analogous structures are important is because it actually explains to us that organisms may look the same, but they're actually not very distantly related. They've only learned to adapt to same types of environments. And so bats and birds and insects, even though they're different, they've just both adapted in similar ways because they both live in the air. Same thing with sharks, penguins, dolphins. They both live in are marine animals. They both spend either all or most of their life in the water. And so they have a very streamlined shape. They have a very torpedo shape is kind of like a barrel shape. So think shape with no limbs, like not like the glove in the whale activity, more like the Ziploc bag. Because they've all adapted to living in a certain type of environment, not necessarily because they've inherited similar things from a recent common ancestor. Okay, so those are analogous structures. Actually, we're going to move on really quickly to embryonic. You know what? Actually, I'm going to end the video here. There's going to be a part 2. It's not going to be as long as this one, but I'm going to finish up evidence in part 2. So look for that. There'll be 2 links on the website. And the second video will start with embryonic development. Okay.